The courtroom was alive with the hum of murmured conversations, the squeak of polished shoes against tiled floors, and the occasional rustle of papers being shuffled. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden streaks across rows of wooden benches filled with people waiting for their turn to stand before Judge Harold Dawson. He sat at the front of the room, his face stern and unyielding beneath a shock of silver hair. His reputation preceded him. He was known as a man who followed the rules strictly and didn't tolerate excuses. Today's docket was long, filled mostly with minor infractions like speeding tickets and noise complaints. But one name caught Harold's attention as he scanned the list: Karoline Leavitt. It wasn't the name itself that stood out. It was the sheer number of parking violations attached to it. Dozens of them. And all in a quiet residential neighborhood where such frequent offenses seemed almost impossible. Something about it nagged at him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. When her case was called, Karoline stepped forward. She was younger than Harold had expected, perhaps in her late 20s, with sharp green eyes and dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She wore simple clothes, a plain blouse and jeans, but there was an air of confidence about her that made her seem older, more experienced. She carried a slim folder under one arm, which she placed carefully on the table in front of her. "Miss Leavitt," Judge Dawson began, leaning slightly forward in his chair. His voice carried authority, the kind that silenced even the noisiest corners of the room. "You've accumulated quite a record here. Care to explain yourself?" Karoline nodded calmly, as if she'd been expecting this moment. "Your Honor," she said, her tone respectful but firm, "I believe these fines are unjustified." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Unjustified? You parked illegally multiple times in areas clearly marked as restricted. How is that not justification?" "Enough?" She opened her folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. "According to Section 234B of the Municipal Parking Code, any signage must be visible from a distance of at least 50 feet during daylight hours. I measured the signs in question myself. They're obstructed by overgrown bushes. Technically, they don't meet the legal requirements for enforcement." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even Harold felt a flicker of surprise. Most defendants either admitted guilt or tried to plead ignorance. Few came armed with specific laws and measurements. Still, he wasn't ready to concede just yet. "That may be true," he replied. "But intent matters. Surely you knew you were parking somewhere inappropriate." Karoline tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Intent is subjective, Your Honor. My car broke down near those spots and I needed to leave it temporarily while arranging repairs. If anything, my actions were necessary rather than negligent." Harold frowned. This woman was clever. Too clever. He glanced down at the file in front of him, double-checking the details of her alleged violations. Everything seemed in order. The dates matched, the locations were correct, and the photos showed her vehicle squarely in restricted zones. There was nothing technically wrong with the evidence. But then Karoline spoke again, her voice steady and clear. "Furthermore, Your Honor, several of these citations were issued after sunset. According to the same code, nighttime enforcement requires additional lighting around the signs. Again, I checked, they weren't adequately lit." The murmurs grew louder. Harold tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, restoring silence. He studied Karoline carefully now, trying to gauge whether she was bluffing. Her demeanor gave nothing away. She stood straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "You seem well versed in the law, Miss Leavitt," Harold remarked dryly. "Are you a lawyer?" "No, Your Honor," she answered. "Just someone who believes in fairness." The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He prided himself on being fair, on applying the law equally to everyone regardless of circumstance. Yet here was this woman, challenging him not with emotion or outrage, but with cold, hard facts. Facts he couldn't easily dismiss. Still, he couldn't let her walk away unpunished. That would set a dangerous precedent. So he cleared his throat and delivered his verdict. "Miss Leavitt, while your points are interesting, the fact remains that you violated posted regulations. I find you guilty and fine you accordingly." Karoline nodded once, accepting the decision without protest. As she turned to leave, however, she paused and slid a small folded piece of paper onto the edge of the judge's bench. Then she walked out of the courtroom, her footsteps echoing softly behind her. Curious, Harold picked up the note after the next case began. Unfolding it, he read the single line written inside. "A fine doesn't settle all debts." For a moment he stared at the words, unsure what to make of them. Was it a threat? A warning? Or simply a statement of principle? Whatever it was, it left him unsettled. He tucked the note into his pocket and tried to focus on the cases ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to Karoline Leavitt. Later that evening, as Harold sat in his study reviewing documents from the day's proceedings, his phone rang. It was Judge Laura Bennett, a colleague from another district court. They exchanged pleasantries briefly before Laura got to the point. "Harold, did you happen to encounter a defendant named Karoline Leavitt recently?" she asked. He hesitated. "Yes, actually." "Why do you ask?" Laura sighed. "She's been popping up in various courts lately. Always wins, too. Big corporations, shady deals, you name it. She's taken them down. Honestly, I'm starting to think she might be some kind of legal prodigy." Harold leaned back in his chair, the note still weighing heavily in his pocket. Prodigy wasn't the first word that came to mind when he thought of Karoline. Clever, yes. Persistent, definitely. But prodigy? Maybe Laura was onto something. After hanging up, Harold spent the rest of the night researching Karoline online. What he found astonished him. She had attended Harvard Law School but dropped out after exposing corruption within the faculty. Since then, she'd worked behind the scenes, helping ordinary citizens fight battles they couldn't win alone. Each victory was meticulously documented, each strategy executed with precision. By the time Harold finally turned off his computer, he realized he'd underestimated Karoline badly. She wasn't just another defendant, she was a force to be reckoned with. And somehow he suspected this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. As he climbed into bed, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that the note she'd left him was more than just words. It was a challenge, a reminder that justice wasn't always black and white. For the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been too quick to pass judgment. The next morning, Judge Harold Dawson woke up with a sense of unease. The note Karoline Leavitt had left on his bench lingered in his mind like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He replayed their conversation in the courtroom over and over, again trying to understand how someone so young could possess such an intricate knowledge of the law. It wasn't just her arguments that intrigued him. It was her calm confidence, her refusal to back down even when faced with authority. Harold decided to dig deeper. After finishing breakfast, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop, searching for anything he could find about Karoline. The more he read, the more astonished he became. She wasn't just some random defendant. She was a phenomenon. Articles mentioned her name in passing, describing how she had dismantled cases against powerful corporations and exposed corrupt officials without ever seeking recognition. There were whispers online about her brilliance, though no one seemed to know much about her personal life or where she came from. One article caught his attention. It detailed how Karoline had helped a group of factory workers sue their employer for unsafe working conditions. The company had hired top-tier lawyers, confident they would crush the case, but Karoline had stepped in, uncovering hidden documents that proved negligence. The workers won, and the company was forced to pay millions in damages. Yet despite her victory, Karoline disappeared afterward, leaving no trace of her involvement except for a brief mention in court records. Harold leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This woman was unlike anyone he'd ever encountered. Most people who challenged the system did so out of anger or desperation. Karoline, however, approached it methodically, almost clinically. It was as if she saw the law not as a barrier but as a tool, a weapon she wielded with precision. As the day went on, Harold found himself distracted during court proceedings. His thoughts kept drifting back to Karoline. Who was she really? Why? Did she choose to fight these battles anonymously? And what had she meant by, "A fine doesn't settle all debts"? The questions swirled in his mind, gnawing at him until he decided to take action. That afternoon, after wrapping up his last case, Harold drove to the address listed in Karoline's file. It turned out to be a small apartment building tucked away in a quiet part of town. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and old books, and the walls were lined with faded posters advertising local events. Harold hesitated for a moment before approaching the mailboxes. Sure enough, there it was. K. Leavitt, Aptern 3B. He climbed the stairs slowly, unsure of what he would say when he finally met her. When he reached her door, he knocked gently, half expecting no one to answer. But after a few seconds, the door creaked open, revealing Karoline standing there with a cup of coffee in hand. "Judge Dawson," she said, raising an eyebrow. "This is unexpected." Harold cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward. "Miss Leavitt, I wanted to talk to you about yesterday." Karoline stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. Her apartment was modest but cozy, filled with shelves crammed with books and legal journals. A laptop sat open on the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of papers and highlighters. Harold noticed a whiteboard propped against the wall, covered in scribbled notes and diagrams. "Can I get you something to drink?" Karoline asked, setting her coffee down. "No, thank you," Harold replied. He glanced around the room, taking in the organized chaos. "I'll be honest, I didn't expect to find you here, or rather, I didn't expect you to be, well, this." Karoline smiled faintly. "What exactly did you expect?" "I'm not sure," Harold admitted. "Someone less calculated, I suppose." She chuckled softly. "Calculated isn't always a bad thing, Your Honor. Sometimes it's necessary." Harold nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "Look, Miss Leavitt, Karoline, I need to ask you something. Why do you do this? Why go through all this trouble to challenge the system when you could easily work within it?" Karoline leaned against the counter, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. "Because the system is broken," she said simply. "It's designed to protect those with power and resources, while everyone else gets trampled. I don't want to work within it. I want to fix it." "But why stay anonymous?" Harold pressed. "You could make a name for yourself, earn respect, influence change from the inside." Karoline shook her head. "Respect isn't given freely, Judge Dawson. It's earned, and often it comes with strings attached. If I step into the spotlight, I become a target. People will try to discredit me, silence me, or worse. Staying under the radar lets me focus on what matters, helping those who can't help themselves." Her words struck a chord with Harold. He had spent years believing in the sanctity of the law, trusting that it worked as long as everyone followed the rules. But now, hearing Karoline speak, he began to see cracks in that belief. The law wasn't perfect, it was shaped by human hands, flawed and biased, and sometimes blind adherence to it only perpetuated injustice. "What about your note?" Harold asked abruptly. "A fine doesn't settle all debts." "What did you mean by that?" Karoline set her cup down and looked at him steadily. "Fines are easy, Your Honor. They're clean, predictable, and final. But justice isn't always so simple. Sometimes the real debt lies in accountability, in forcing those in power to face the consequences of their actions. That's what I aim for." Harold fell silent, absorbing her words. For the first time in his career, he felt uncertain, not about the law itself, but about his role in enforcing it. Was he truly serving justice, or merely maintaining order? Before he could respond, Karoline added, "You seem troubled, Judge Dawson. Is there something specific you wanted to discuss?" Harold hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he told her about the pressure he'd been facing lately. Lawyers from big firms had started questioning his rulings, accusing him of bias whenever defendants, like Karoline, managed to turn the tables. Some had even hinted at filing formal complaints. The threat of scrutiny weighed heavily on him, making it harder to rule impartially. To his surprise, Karoline didn't react with sympathy or judgment. Instead, she listened intently, nodding occasionally. When he finished, she said, "They're afraid of you, Judge Dawson. Not because you're biased, but because you have the power to disrupt their games. Don't let them intimidate you into complacency." Her advice stunned him. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, so bluntly, yet with genuine concern. For a moment he considered arguing, defending his position, but deep down he knew she was right. As the evening wore on, their conversation shifted to broader topics: the flaws in the legal system, the importance of empathy in decision-making, and the delicate balance between fairness and pragmatism. By the time Harold left, he felt both enlightened and unsettled. Karoline had challenged everything he thought he knew about justice, and he wasn't sure how to reconcile that with his duty as a judge. Driving home, Harold realized something important. Karoline wasn't just a legal genius, she was a mirror reflecting the parts of the system he'd chosen to ignore. Whether he liked it or not, she had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, and as much as he wanted to dismiss her, he couldn't shake the feeling that she might be onto something. When he arrived home, Harold poured himself a glass of water and stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Somewhere out there, Karoline was probably already planning her next move, preparing to take on another battle against the odds. And for the first time, Harold found himself hoping she'd succeed. Weeks passed, and Judge Harold Dawson tried to push thoughts of Karoline Leavitt out of his mind. He returned to his routine, presiding over cases with the same strictness he always had. But no matter how hard he focused on his work, her words lingered in the back of his thoughts. "Justice isn't always clean or predictable," she had said. Those words haunted him, especially when he saw defendants who reminded him of her, people fighting against systems far bigger than themselves. Then came the case that changed everything. It was a high-profile lawsuit involving Titan Corp, one of the largest real estate developers in the country. The plaintiffs were residents of Willow Heights, a low-income housing complex that Titan Corp wanted to demolish to make way for luxury condos. According to the company, the residents had been offered fair compensation and relocation assistance. But the residents claimed otherwise, saying they were being illegally evicted without proper notice or support. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial began. On one side sat Titan Corp's legal team, a group of polished, expensive lawyers who radiated confidence. On the other side was Daniel Myers, a young attorney struggling to represent the residents. Daniel looked overwhelmed, his tie slightly crooked and his notes scattered across the table. It was clear from the start that he didn't have the resources to compete with Titan Corp's army of experts and evidence. Harold felt a pang of sympathy for Daniel, but reminded himself to remain impartial. Still, as the trial unfolded, it became obvious that the scales were tipped heavily in Titan Corp's favor. Their arguments were sharp, their evidence meticulously prepared. Every time Daniel tried to counter, he stumbled over objections raised by the opposing counsel. By the end of the first day, Harold could tell the residents' chances of winning were slim. That evening, Harold stayed late in his chambers, reviewing the case files. He hated feeling powerless, knowing that the law often favored those with money and influence. Just as he was about to pack up and leave, there was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," Harold called, expecting it to be a clerk. Instead, Karoline Leavitt stepped inside, carrying her usual slim folder. "Miss Leavitt," Harold said, surprised. "What brings you here?" Karoline closed the door behind her and approached his desk. "I heard about the Willow Heights case," she said. "Thought you might need some help." Harold frowned. "This is a serious matter, Karoline. You can't just walk into my chambers uninvited." "I'm not here for you," she replied calmly. "I'm here for them, the residents. They deserve a fair shot, don't they?" Harold sighed, rubbing his temples. "I agree, but what can you do? You're not even licensed to practice law." Karoline smiled faintly. "I don't need a license to offer advice. Besides, I've already spoken to Daniel. He's willing to let me assist him." Harold stared at her, unsure whether to be impressed or frustrated. "And what makes you think I'll allow this?" "You won't have to," Karoline said. "Officially, I'll just be sitting in the gallery, taking notes." Unofficially, she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Despite himself, Harold felt a flicker of curiosity. If anyone could level the playing field, it was Karoline. Reluctantly, he nodded. Fine, but if anything goes wrong, I'll hold you responsible. Fair enough, Karoline said, turning to leave. Before stepping out, she glanced back at him. Oh, and Judge Dawson? Try to keep an open mind. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches, eager to cover the dramatic showdown between David and Goliath. When Karoline entered, she slipped quietly into the front row of the gallery, opening her folder and pretending to take notes. To anyone watching, she looked like just another observer. The trial resumed, and things started poorly for Daniel. Titan Corp's lead attorney, a man named Richard Grayson, launched into a scathing cross-examination of the first witness, a single mother named Maria Lopez, who lived in Willow Heights. Grayson accused her of lying about receiving eviction notices, presenting documents that appeared to contradict her testimony. Daniel struggled to object effectively, fumbling over objections and missing key opportunities to challenge the evidence. As Maria grew visibly flustered, Harold noticed Karoline scribbling furiously in her notebook. After a few minutes, she leaned forward slightly and whispered something to Daniel, who hesitated before nodding. To everyone's surprise, Daniel suddenly stood up. Objection, Your Honor, these documents are forged. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Grayson smirked, clearly amused. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We have certified copies. Certified doesn't mean authentic, Daniel interrupted, surprising even himself with his newfound confidence. If you'll allow me, I'd like to request a handwriting analysis of the signatures on these notices. Grayson's smirk faltered. Harold raised an eyebrow. Do you have grounds for this accusation, Mr. Myers? Yes, Your Honor, Daniel said, pulling out a magnifying glass and pointing to subtle inconsistencies in the ink and font. These weren't signed by the building manager. They were created using software designed to mimic official documents. Grayson sputtered, trying to regain control. This is absurd. My client follows all regulations. We'll see about that, Harold interjected, cutting him off. Motion granted. The authenticity of these documents will be verified before we proceed further. As the session adjourned for the day, Harold couldn't help but glance toward the gallery. Karoline gave him a small, knowing smile before disappearing into the crowd. Over the next few days, Karoline continued to guide Daniel behind the scenes. She helped him dig up public records proving that Titan Corp had ignored mandatory inspections for years, putting residents at risk. She located former employees willing to testify about illegal practices within the company, and most importantly, she taught Daniel how to anticipate Grayson's moves, turning the tables on Titan Corp's seemingly unbeatable strategy. Each day brought new revelations, each more damning than the last. By the time closing arguments rolled around, the tide had turned completely. Where once Titan Team had seemed invincible, they now looked desperate, scrambling to defend themselves against a barrage of irrefutable evidence. On the final day of the trial, Karoline sat silently in the gallery as Daniel delivered his closing statement. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, it grew stronger. He painted a vivid picture of the injustice faced by the residents of Willow Heights, not just in this case, but in countless others like it. He appealed to the jury's sense of fairness, urging them to stand up against corporate greed. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Grayson looked shaken. Harold watched closely as the jury deliberated, wondering what verdict they would reach. Hours later, the foreman stood up and read their decision. Guilty on all counts. Titan Corp was ordered to halt demolition plans, provide fair compensation to the residents, and pay hefty fines for its misconduct. Cheers erupted in the courtroom as the residents hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Daniel looked dazed, as if he couldn't believe what had happened. Harold banged his gavel repeatedly to restore order, though he couldn't suppress a small smile. Amid the chaos, Harold scanned the gallery for Karoline, but she was gone. Once again, she had vanished without fanfare, leaving only whispers of her brilliance behind. Later that night, Harold sat alone in his study, reflecting on the trial. He realized now that justice wasn't just about following rules, it was about protecting people. And sometimes that meant bending the system to serve its true purpose. He pulled out the note Karoline had left him weeks ago. A fine doesn't settle all debts. This time, he understood exactly what she meant. The victory in the Willow Heights case felt monumental, but it came with consequences. Judge Harold Dawson had expected backlash from Titan Corp and their powerful allies, but he hadn't anticipated how far they would go to retaliate. Within days of the verdict, anonymous letters began arriving at his home. Some were thinly veiled threats warning him to watch his step. Others accused him of corruption, claiming he had conspired with Karoline Leavitt to undermine justice. Harold tried to brush it off at first. He'd faced criticism before, and he knew standing up to big corporations often made enemies. But as the threats escalated, strange cars parked outside his house late at night, phone calls with no one speaking on the other end, he started to feel uneasy. For the first time in years, he questioned whether he was cut out for this job. At work, things weren't much better. Titan Corp filed a formal complaint against him, alleging bias in favor of the plaintiffs. Other judges began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone under scrutiny. Even Laura Bennett, who had once praised Harold's integrity, avoided eye contact when they passed in the courthouse hallway. Feeling isolated and overwhelmed, Harold decided to reach out to Karoline. She had vanished after the trial, slipping away without so much as a goodbye. But something told him she wouldn't have left town entirely. If anyone could help him navigate this mess, it was her. He found her exactly where he suspected she might be, in the same coffee shop where they'd first met weeks earlier. She sat in the corner, sipping black coffee while flipping through a thick legal journal. Her face lit up slightly when she saw him approaching. "Judge Dawson," she said, closing the book. "I wondered when you'd show up." Harold slid into the seat across from her. "You knew I'd come?" "I figured you'd hit a rough patch," Karoline admitted. "Titan Corp isn't used to losing. When they do, they lash out." "They're accusing me of corruption," Harold said, his voice low. "They're trying to ruin my career." Karoline nodded, unsurprised. "It's standard practice. Attack the messenger instead of addressing the message. They'll throw everything they've got at you until you either cave or fight back harder." "So what do I do?" Harold asked, leaning forward. "How do I prove I didn't do anything wrong?" "You don't," Karoline replied simply. "Not directly, anyway. Instead, you expose them. Show everyone why they're so desperate to discredit you." Harold frowned. "Expose them how?" "They've already painted me as the bad guy. By hitting them where it hurts most, their reputation," Karoline explained. "Remember those former employees who testified during the trial? Reach out to them again. Ask if they're willing to share more stories about Titan Corp's shady dealings. Leak those stories to reporters. Let the public decide who the real villain is." It sounded risky, but Harold couldn't deny it made sense. The media loved scandals, and if enough dirt surfaced on Titan Corp, the focus would shift away from him. Still, he hesitated. "What about retaliation?" he asked. "Won't they come after me even harder if I dig deeper?" "They will," Karoline said bluntly. "But here's the thing, Judge Dawson. Fear only works if you let it control you. Stand your ground and they'll eventually back off. Bullies always do." Her words struck a nerve. Harold realized he'd been letting fear dictate his actions, or rather his inaction. He'd spent his entire career playing it safe, sticking to the rules, avoiding controversy. And look where that had gotten him. Isolated, mistrusted, and under attack. "I'll do it," Harold said finally. "Whatever it takes." Karoline smiled faintly. "Good. Just remember, you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing it for everyone who depends on people like you to protect them." Over the next few weeks, Harold threw himself into gathering evidence against Titan Corp. With Karoline's guidance, he tracked down additional whistleblowers willing to speak out. One former construction manager revealed that the company routinely cut corners on safety regulations to save money. Another described how executives bribed inspectors to overlook violations. Each story added fuel to the fire, painting Titan Corp as a greedy, unethical corporation. Meanwhile, Karoline worked quietly behind the scenes, connecting Harold with journalists who specialized in investigative reporting. Together, they crafted a narrative that highlighted not just the Willow Heights case, but also broader patterns of misconduct within Titan Corp. Headlines began appearing in newspapers and online articles. Titan Corp accused of endangering lives. For profit, inside the real estate giant's web of lies, public outrage grew quickly. Protesters gathered outside Titan Corp's headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice over greed" and "Stop evicting families." Social media exploded with hashtags condemning the company. For the first time, Harold felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, a movement demanding accountability and fairness. But the pressure on him intensified too. Titan Corp's lawyers subpoenaed his emails, searching for any hint of wrongdoing. Reporters camped outside his house, eager for quotes or reactions. Friends and colleagues urged him to step down, warning that the controversy would destroy his career. Through it all, Karoline remained a steady presence. She checked in regularly, offering advice and encouragement. "Keep going," she told him during one late-night call. "You're stronger than you think." Harold took her words to heart. He refused to bow to Titan Corp's demands, continuing to support the residents of Willow Heights and others fighting similar battles. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Independent investigations confirmed many of the allegations against Titan Corp, leading to lawsuits and regulatory fines. The company's stock plummeted, and its CEO resigned amid mounting scandals. One evening, as Harold sat in his study reviewing the latest news updates, he received a text from Karoline. "Meet me at the coffee shop tomorrow morning. There's something we need to discuss." Curious, Harold arrived early the next day. Karoline was already there, nursing a cup of coffee and looking unusually pensive. "What's going on?" Harold asked, sliding into the seat across from her. Karoline set her cup down and looked at him seriously. "Titan Corp isn't done yet. They're planning one last move, a smear campaign targeting you personally. They'll release private information, try to paint you as corrupt or incompetent." Harold felt a chill run down his spine. "How do you know this?" "I have sources," Karoline said vaguely. "The important thing is, you need to prepare. Release your side of the story before they can twist it. Be honest, transparent, and unapologetic." Harold nodded slowly. "And then what? What happens after that?" "That depends on you," Karoline replied. "This fight has shown you what's possible when you stand firm. Will you keep pushing for change, or will you retreat back to the way things were?" Harold didn't answer right away. He thought about the residents of Willow Heights whose lives had been transformed by the trial. He thought about Daniel Myers, who had gone from an inexperienced lawyer to a champion for justice. And he thought about Karoline, whose quiet determination had inspired him to see the law and himself in a new light. "I'll keep going," Harold said finally, "for as long as it takes." Karoline smiled, a rare flash of warmth crossing her face. "That's what I hoped you'd say." As they parted ways later that morning, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. Karoline had become more than just a mentor or ally. She was a reminder of what justice truly meant. And though he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay in store. For the first time in years, Harold Dawson walked away from the coffee shop feeling hopeful, not just about his own future, but about the future of the system. He had sworn to serve. Months passed, and life in the courthouse returned to a semblance of normalcy. The storm surrounding Titan Corp had finally begun to settle. Investigations into the company's practices led to criminal charges against several top executives, and public opinion turned sharply against them. The once mighty corporation was now a shadow of its former self, struggling to rebuild trust while facing lawsuits from multiple fronts. Judge Harold Dawson, however, found himself changed forever. The experience had left an indelible mark on him, reshaping how he viewed his role as a judge. No longer did he see himself merely as an enforcer of rules. Instead, he saw himself as a guardian of fairness, a person responsible for ensuring that justice wasn't just done but seen to be done. He started implementing small changes in his courtroom, like giving defendants more time to present their cases or asking follow-up questions to clarify confusing points. These adjustments may have seemed minor, but they made a world of difference to those who felt unheard. Despite these efforts, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was missing. Karoline Leavitt had disappeared again, after their last meeting at the coffee shop, leaving behind only faint traces of her influence. There were rumors of her involvement in other high-profile cases across the country, though nothing concrete ever surfaced. Harold wondered if she would ever resurface in his life, or if their paths had crossed for the final time. One crisp autumn morning, Harold arrived at the courthouse early, enjoying the quiet before the day's chaos began. As he unlocked his chambers, he noticed an envelope tucked under the door. It was plain white with no return address. Curious, he opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Written in neat handwriting were 3 words: "Justice is alive." Harold smiled faintly, recognizing Karoline's signature style. She didn't need to sign her name. The message itself was enough. For a moment, he considered tracking her down, perhaps visiting the coffee shop where they'd shared so many pivotal conversations. But deep down, he knew better. Karoline thrived in the shadows, working tirelessly to tip the scales toward fairness without seeking recognition. Trying to find her might only push her further away. Instead, Harold tucked the note into his desk drawer, alongside the one she had left on his bench months ago. Together, they served as reminders of the lessons he'd learned. That justice wasn't always black and white, that courage often required stepping outside comfort zones, and that sometimes the most powerful voices were the ones that stayed silent. As the weeks turned into months, Harold continued to hear whispers of Karoline's exploits. A local news article reported how a group of factory workers won a lawsuit against a polluting chemical plant, citing mysterious evidence that appeared out of nowhere. Another story highlighted how a wrongfully convicted man walked free after years in prison, thanks to newly uncovered documents pointing to prosecutorial misconduct. Each victory bore the unmistakable fingerprints of Karoline's brilliance, even if her name never appeared in print. Harold began to embrace the idea that Karoline wasn't just one person but a symbol, a representation of what could be achieved when someone dedicated themselves fully to the pursuit of justice. Inspired by her example, he started mentoring young lawyers like Daniel Myers, encouraging them to think creatively and challenge the status quo. He also reached out to colleagues, proposing reforms aimed at making the legal system more accessible to ordinary people. Some resisted, clinging to tradition, but others joined him, eager to create meaningful change. One evening, as Harold sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on everything that had happened since meeting Karoline. The threats, the victories, the doubts, they all felt distant now, like chapters in a book he had already closed. Yet their impact lingered, shaping him into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. His thoughts drifted back to the note she had written, "A fine doesn't settle all debts." At the time, he hadn't understood its full meaning. Now he realized it wasn't just about monetary penalties or legal consequences. It was about accountability, the kind that forced individuals and institutions to confront the harm they caused and take steps to repair it. True justice, Harold had come to believe, wasn't about punishment. It was about healing. The next morning, Harold entered the courtroom with renewed purpose. Today's docket included a mix of routine cases, traffic violations, small claims, disputes, but he approached each one with the same level of care and attention. When a young mother argued that her parking ticket was unjust because she had rushed her child to the hospital, Harold listened patiently, asking thoughtful questions before rendering his decision. When a tenant accused their landlord of neglecting repairs, Harold encouraged both parties to work together, rather than resorting to hostility. By lunchtime, Harold felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he understood why Karoline fought so hard, not for glory or recognition, but because every case mattered. Every person deserved to be heard, every injustice addressed. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that required constant vigilance and unwavering commitment. After court adjourned for the day, Harold decided to take a walk through the park near his house. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. As he strolled along the path, he spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench sipping coffee and flipping through a worn legal journal. His heart skipped a beat. "Karoline?" he called out tentatively. She looked up, her green eyes lighting up with recognition. "Judge Dawson," she said, closing the book. "Fancy running into you here." Harold chuckled softly as he approached. "I thought you might be long gone by now." "I considered it," Karoline admitted. "But something told me to stick around a while longer." They sat together in companionable silence, watching children play and dogs chase frisbees. After a while, Harold spoke. "Thank you," he said simply. "For everything." Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You don't owe me thanks. You did the hard part, standing firm when it mattered most." "But you showed me the way," Harold countered. "Without you, I might still be blindly following rules without questioning whether they're fair." Karoline smiled faintly. "Maybe, or maybe you would have figured it out on your own eventually. People like you're capable of great things when given the chance." Harold shook his head. "People like me need people like you to remind us of what really matters." They sat there for a little longer, neither feeling the need to fill the silence. Eventually, Karoline stood up, brushing leaves off her jeans. "Well, I should get going. There's another case waiting for me somewhere." "Will I see you again?" Harold asked, half hoping for a yes, half preparing for a no. "Who knows?" Karoline replied with a mischievous glint in her eye. "But if you do, try not to find me this time." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing among the trees. Harold watched her go, a bittersweet smile on his face. He didn't know where her path would lead next, but he knew one thing for certain. Wherever she went, justice would follow. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Harold took a deep breath and headed home. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. And somewhere, far away, Karoline Leavitt was probably already planning her next move.